All right. Hey guys, I hope you're having a good week. Sorry I've been late on getting this up, but hopefully for those of you that watch the narrated versions of the PowerPoint, they're helpful for you. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about chapter 6. A learning disability we sort of talked about at the beginning of last week when we met. Dyslexia is considered a learning disability, but basically what a learning disability is it's a disorder in your process to understand language, and it could be manifested in listening, thinking, speaking, reading, writing, spelling, or doing math calculations, all sorts of things. So it can include a perceptual disability, a brain injury, a minimal brain dysfunction, dyslexia, developmental aphasia, all sorts of things that sort of fall under that umbrella. Like I showed you last week when I showed you the eligibility document, there was 8 categories. What it excludes, though, what it's saying is it cannot be a learning disability if you have some sort of hearing impairment, because maybe your learning is impaired because of your hearing, a visual impairment, motor disabilities, mental retardation, emotional disturbance, or if you come from an economic, cultural, or environmental disadvantage, you could be excluded. And this is simply because sometimes it's not, you haven't been exposed to the information. So you don't necessarily have a learning disability until they can prove that you've been taught what you need to learn and you're still not learning it. So sometimes those that come from a disadvantaged household simply don't have the exposure, so we have to make sure that we give them the exposure. There's other definitions as well, but they do know that it's a neurological disorder, so it's some sort of impairment in the way that our brain is analyzing the information that we're hearing and reading and listening to, and it affects our academic learning. The American Psychiatric Association thinks it's a single diagnosis rather than specific areas. So they don't necessarily agree that we should break it up into dyslexia and dyscalculia. They just think a single diagnosis works. They believe on focusing on the academic performance, so RTI aspect, and not necessarily looking at the IQ achievement. But physicians do use developmental, family, and educational history to make that determination. When we look at identification, we already talked about this in the past, but you can either do achievement ability discrepancy model, which we talked about, the IQ model, or we can do the RTI model. So there's sort of 2 different models to look at when you're identifying with a specific learning disability. Here's an interesting fact. So I was at my friend's house last week, and her daughter um, has a disability and they're not really sure which one. And I was looking at the evaluation and she said, well, can we look at SLD and use the RTI data? And they just said, well, Oldham County doesn't use RTI. We use discrepancy. And that was that. Like, there was no discussion. It was just, sorry, we don't do that here, which I thought was kind of interesting, but I guess they can say that. So anyways, I just thought you should know, like we talked about, there was the 2 ways, but a county can pick one way and not even consider using the other way, which I'm not really sure if that's legal, but maybe it is. I plan to look into that. When we look at RTI, we know that there's little evidence on the effectiveness of it, and most of the research is focused only on reading. So we know that it's academics and behavior, and reading can be done, or academics can be done on reading, it can be done on writing, it can be done on math, and there's a lot of good RTI going on for reading. There's really not a lot going on for writing at all, and math is pretty minimal. So that's one thing to be cautious of if we're using RTI to qualify a student as SLD math or SLD writing. Do we really have enough data to prove that they have a disability in that area? The other thing is, right here it says a lot of teachers are failing to use evidence-based instruction in Tier 1, and so that's that core instruction. So when the teachers are teaching reading in their classroom every day, are they using a systematic, explicit curriculum, or are they sort of flying by the seat of their pants and doing different reading instruction, but not necessarily following it the way that they should be? So, and if they're not, then they're not getting core instruction in reading, which trickles up, right? Maybe the students are not being effective because they're not getting good reading instruction, and then they end up in RTI, and they don't do well in RTI, so they end up with a disability, all because they really didn't have a teacher teaching it the way that they needed to be. So that's just something to think about. And there's also a lot of variability that happens in Tier 2. So we touched on this. Some schools use like a computer intervention. Some schools do small reading groups, but are they using like systematic intervention, or are they just doing small reading groups? So it's really hard to tell what exactly is going on in RTI, and it definitely depends school by school, or sometimes district by district. And then down here they talk about recycling, and I sort of talked about that, how you can be tier 2 round 3, and then tier 1 round 2, and then go back to tier, go back and forth and back and forth, back and forth, but you're still stuck in RTI. So there's still a struggle there. So just something to think about. Causes. Specific learning disabilities are caused by a lot of things. Mainly they call it a dysfunction, but it's a variability in the way that your brain was formed and developed, and the way that it understands the information that it's receiving or that it's getting out. So when we talk about speech and language, we sort of understand language in two ways. One is the way that we receive the language, that's like decoding the information, and then the way that we get the language out, which is called encoding. So when we read it, we're understanding it. When we get it out, we're trying to encode or express it. So it could be receptive and expressive. So sometimes students can understand it, they just can't get it out on paper. So that's just trying to they understand it fine, but they can't get it out, and that's the expressive aspect. Then there's a lot of research that shows that learning disabilities are genetic. So likely if you have a student or a parent who had a learning disability, it's likely that they have a child with a learning disability or a sibling with a learning disability. It's a very strong gene, actually. So something to think in mind. Fetal alcohol syndrome can touch on a learning disability. If it's a very mild case of fetal alcohol syndrome, you'll see fetal alcohol syndrome in many different chapters, just depending on the severity of it. Another thing to keep in mind is sometimes premature birth can cause a learning disability. Okay, so some behavioral characteristics. This just talks about inter-individual or intra-individual. Just means the difference between themselves. Like sometimes they do really well in one class and not another, or comparing to each other. So there's the point that you need to see is this variation part. A learning disability is as different for each person as your fingerprint might be. So just because a person has dyslexia doesn't mean that they all have the same characteristics. Okay, so there's just a lot of variation between the person, as well as sometimes the person's really successful in one subject and not successful in another. So there's variation even between that single person. So something to think about. In reading, there's lots of different things that you could struggle with. The first one's dyslexia, which we talked about last week, just real quick. Phonological and phonemic awareness, and that sort of falls back up under dyslexia. Decoding, and that is just sounding out, breaking apart the words and understanding what it is. Fluency and comprehension, so how quickly are you reading and how well are you understanding it. And then prosody is a word that we use in reading that talks about the inflection of your voice, the way that you're reading it. Are you reading it with what they call prosody? So think about like a monotone style of reading, and then an average reader who you're talking and your voice inflection goes up, it raises up for a question mark, or it sort of flattens out for a period. So all of those things, sort of prosody brings in fluency, comprehension, and then overall flow of reading is the best way I think I would explain that. Then we have dysgraphia, and that's sort of impacting your written language. So like I was saying, they might have a good idea, but they can't get it down on paper. So an example of that is like a student might want to say the dinosaur was gigantic, but they can't figure out how to spell dinosaur, so they just put it. And they can't figure out how to spell gigantic, so they put big. So their sentence says, it was big. When really in their head they had a much better sentence, they just couldn't figure out how to get it on paper. And that's typically what happens for those students with dysgraphia. If you ask them a story, they'll tell you that story all day long. But the second you put a piece of paper and a pen in front of them, it ends up being like 2 or 3 sentences. So that's the written aspect part of it. And then when we look at spoken language, there's syntax, semantics, pragmatics. All of this stuff is in your book. I forget exactly what page it's on, but it's really good to know and understand. And it'll come back around when we talk about communication disorders, which is in chapter 10, so that's coming up too. But that will definitely come around and around again. And then in math is dyscalculia. Let me push pause. Okay, I found it. I pushed pause. So 128, it talks about semantics, phonology, syntax, pragmatics, and all of that will come back up, like I said, in communications. But that's good information to know and understand. All right. Oh, and then dyscalculia is just the inability to understand math formulas, or sometimes they have a hard time with place value, things like that. Okay, so some other aspects that come along with a learning disability, which are interesting, are a lot of these what we call executive functioning. So things that impact this child they don't really even understand. They have nothing related to do with academics, but it's all about that executive functioning piece. And so sometimes their coordination is off, their perception or their motor skills are off. Learning disabilities definitely occur with ADHD. So we call dyslexia or learning disabilities and their comorbid friends, and ADHD is one of those. And then, so memory is also sometimes difficult. Their short term and their working memory, and then their retrieval of information. So some psychologist one time told me this analogy, which I really enjoy, so I'll share it with you. So when you talk about memory or executive functioning, and you think about some students, right? You have some who are, or maybe you think about adults, you have some who are very organized and very neat freaks, and so they might have a shirt drawer and a sock drawer and, you know, shorts, and they fold them all. Sometimes they even organize them by color. Everything's easy to find. In the morning, you just get what you need and you go. If you're downstairs, you're running out the door, you say, run up and get some socks. They can get some socks and come right back down. Those people that have issues with executive functioning, it's like, you know, and I do this still sometimes too. You do your laundry, but you didn't fold it, so it's just all in a basket. And so it's like sending a child up to their room, right, and saying, go get your socks, we're leaving. And you have one child that might go up and get their perfectly matched socks out of their drawer because that's how they like to organize it. And you have another student who might go to their laundry basket and just pull any sort of socks that they can get and put on their feet. And then you have the other student that just keeps pulling socks out until they find the one that matches the first one they got. And so it takes them forever because they keep looking for the right one. They look for the right one and they look for the right one. Rather than the student who just put the two on, put their shoes on, you can't tell that they're unmatched because they've compensated for the fact that they didn't have an organized memory. They didn't have an organized drawer. And so that's sort of what memory is like. Can you run and retrieve what you need and come back? Or are you running and sort of picking things out of that laundry basket until you find exactly what you need in your memory? And then you're like, oh yeah, here it is. Now I remember it. So people with learning disabilities really struggle with that memory piece, and it often takes them a lot longer to retrieve what they need from their memory. Once again, another task would be like the self-regulation or the metacognition. This also falls under executive functioning. So sometimes you get something and they don't necessarily realize what has to be done in order for it to be finished. Sort of like some of my hybrid students who open up the hybrid page and say, hey, for my 5 points, I have to go to this website and fill out this worksheet. And they sort of skip all of the other things. But in order to do the worksheet or the quiz well, you have to have done those things, right? And so sometimes students do that. They open up a project or they open up a assignment and they don't really take the time to figure out what do I need to do in order to be successful. They just go for it, right? They just jump right in and then they realize like, oh wait, maybe I'm in over my head. They also have a hard time finding the appropriate strategy. So think about like in math, if you give them a formula, sometimes they can't figure out what strategy to use. And so they need a lot of visual cues or visual aids, things like that. And then this one, monitor and adjusting their performance. So you know how sometimes you're reading and then your brain sort of like wanders off and you think about, you guys probably don't think about your grocery list, but think about what you're going to do or what's going on this weekend or whatever. So, and then you're like a couple paragraphs down and you're like, wait a minute, I was just daydreaming. Let me go back and figure out where it was and then let me reread from there. A lot of the times, students have a hard time monitoring that and adjusting their performance. So they might be like, oh wait, I was just thinking about the basketball game. Oh well, let's just keep going. And so they've missed that whole chunk of reading. And let's see, there's a lot of social and emotional problems that come along with students with learning disabilities because a lot of the times they understand that they are a little bit different than the others, and they get self-conscious, they get down on themselves, and so that's just something to think about. And then this learned helplessness is a huge deal. Sometimes students, especially those that have IEPs, know that they'll get help. So before even trying, they'll be like, I need help. So you have to learn to be like, well, you need to try it, and then I'll come support you. after you give it a good try. So that's something to think about as well. It looks like we're getting to the end of this 15-minute block. So I will close this one and start a new one in just a second.